Hello, welcome to week 5. We have a couple different short lectures this week. So our first one is going to be on women in the colonies. Okay, so here we have 17th century colonial women. So as you know, or hopefully you remember, Jamestown was founded in 1607. It wasn't until the following year that the first 2 women arrived in Jamestown. Largely, it was thought that women were unnecessary for exploration, and only once colonization was underway would women be brought in. Because, of course, their main purpose in life, maybe their only purpose in life, was breeding. And so in 1608, they were shipped over as an incentive. Women were shipped as an incentive to get more men over to the colony of Jamestown. Women, of course, were not given their own land, so the thought there was that if women were allowed to have their own land, they would be less likely to get married. Which, you know, if you're treating women like that, that's probably true. However, men could claim extra land on behalf of their wives, even if the wives couldn't own it themselves. So women were not allowed to own property. As I did mention, women were shipped over as an incentive. And so if you imagine being one of the first 2 women being shipped over to Jamestown, it's a scary proposition. Okay, so a lot of women were indentured servants. And so some things that women would do as servants: caring for livestock, performing agricultural work, doing laundry, nursing, gardening, cooking, different, mostly activities that would take place indoors. And they would receive clothing, some sort of commodity at the end of their service, so that they could start their life. But this, of course, is only if they're still alive. So half of the women who were indentured servants did not live to see the end of their service, so they died while they were in service. And then there were some women who are called lucky, and they would be lucky if a wealthy planter might pay off the remainder of her service in order to marry her. And so, you know, you couldn't really say no to something like that, right? Because it's like, no thanks, I'd rather be enslaved for another 3 years than marry you. Of course, women are going to take them up on that. So it is not a forced marriage, but very difficult to say no to such a thing. Otherwise, a servant is expected to remain unmarried and without a child until her service is complete. If she did have a child while she was in service, that would add another 2 years onto her contract. Okay. This is my funny joke, guys. Women's rights in the early colonies. So really there weren't any. They had heavy pressure to marry and start having babies as soon as possible and constantly. So I guess they had a right to having children. They could have about 10 to 12 children, but about half of those died before adulthood, and about a quarter survived their first year. So really high death rates. Having babies, of course, was dangerous. So we don't have the medical technology that we have currently. So if you think about having 10 to 12 kids, already unpleasant today, but then on top of that, you know, every time you get pregnant, it's a roll of the dice whether you're going to make it out of that birth. Men, of course, were in charge of everything. So society throughout the colonies, heavily patriarchal. If the man was absent, like went on a trip somewhere, the wife would be called the deputy husband, unless she had a son that was old enough to breathe, and then that son would be the man of the house. So women, you know, really were in charge of home management, gardens, cooking, cleaning, children, and this is even worse for women who are enslaved and even indentured servants. So in 1619, the first enslaved people were brought to the British colonies in Jamestown, and they either farmed land or performed housework, but of course they had no end to their term of service, so they were going to be performing this forced labor for the rest of their lives. And of course that's, you know, the worst option here when we're talking about women's rights. Puritan New England had some interesting qualities to it. So Puritans in general were very hardworking. They had a strong work ethic, And Puritan women were no exception, so they were also hardworking, but they were bound to the home. So they took care of chores, childcare, constantly having babies. They had like no free time, and they were performing unpaid labor, which of course offers no power. So let's see, little to no free time, of course, no participation in town meetings. Town meetings, as I've mentioned before, were an integral part of Puritan life. Society would come together at these meetings, but women were not allowed to go to government meetings. They could go to religious meetings. And even if they were allowed to go to religious meetings, they were not allowed to have any sort of opinion about what was being said. They could just listen along and nod. So women had no control over their property, no legal standing. The one thing is with Puritan women, there was one exception, and those are widows. So a woman whose husband has died, she is able in Puritan society to take on his property, and then give property once she, in her will, give property to others. And that's the only exception. So any other woman, not allowed to own property, not allowed to make legal documents. And that, we'll talk about in a minute, that will cause some problems with the Salem witch trials, women with interesting amounts of power. Women do have slightly more equality in religious affairs. Like I said, they could go to meetings, but they could not be ministers. They could not have an opinion about what was being said, but they could read the Bible for themselves, just not try and interpret it. So life was heavily patriarchal. Everyone in Puritan society, was under the control of at least one man. And I've mentioned that in New England, people had longer lifespans, and so we have grandfathers and great-grandfathers, and they're all ruling the family. So there's all this hierarchy throughout society where the men are at the top, and it becomes very stifling for women, especially in Puritan New England. And that becomes another thing that leads to the Salem witch trials. Okay, so we do have some depictions of Puritan society that you may have read or seen on film or something else. We have Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter. He wrote Young Goodman Brown. Nathaniel Hawthorne was very critical of Puritan society, and part of this is because he had this familial shame about it. His great-granduncle, I believe, was one of the judges during the Salem witch trials, and he was the only judge who did not later regret what he had done. And so Nathaniel Hawthorne, thought that was shameful. He changed his name a little bit, and so Judge Hawthorne, his name doesn't have this W, so Nathaniel Hawthorne added the W. Ooh, sneaky, sneaky. Anyhow, so we have that. Scarlet Letter, of course, really depicts the shame involved in having any sort of extramarital affair. And Young Goodman Brown is another, novel about 17th century Puritan Salem. Another work you may be familiar with is Arthur Miller's The Crucible. And this was written during the communist scare in the 1950s, where he used this witch hunt as an allegory for the House of Un-American Activities Committee's witch hunt. And so he ended up being sentenced to prison for writing this. He was blacklisted. He had his passport taken away. Eventually it was overturned, but he was heavily punished for writing The Crucible. Okay. So let's talk about the witch trials just a little bit, because it's one of those shameful stains on our country's history, right? And everyone's interested about it. So in the first century of English colonization, 344 New Englanders were charged with witchcraft. So this was fairly common, having witchcraft trials, but the one that we know mainly of is the Salem witch trials, and that was in 1692 to 93. And in this case, 20 people were executed. So 19 of those people were hanged, and one of them was crushed with stone. More than 3/4 of the people accused in the Salem witch trials were women. And let's see. Violations of gender norms. Am I ready to talk about that? I suppose so. So, widows, like I mentioned, would sometimes have large inheritance. They would refuse to remarry so they could hang on to that property and have more power. Some other violations were sexual offenses. So, women who were having sex before marriage, or maybe having an affair, maybe having a child out of wedlock, maybe having a relationship with another woman, any sort of, quote, offense. And then there are outcasts. So anyone who, didn't go to church very much or was unpopular with other people in society. So let's talk about some of the first few women that were accused, and you'll see that they fit into these violations of gender norms. So the first three, we have Sarah Good. Sarah Good was homeless. She was a beggar. It was seen as she had rejected Puritan ideals of self-control and discipline, work ethic. So she was up there. Sarah Osborne. She rarely attended church, and she was a widow who was involved in an inheritance dispute with her son-in-law. So because she had this amount of power, that was kind of a danger. Wow, the dogs are really going at it. And then the third person is a woman named Tituba, and she was an enslaved woman from the Caribbean. And she was an easy target because she was different than everyone. So they, of course, end up being the first three. We have 62 people total who were in custody during these witch trials. The first woman to be executed is Bridget Bishop. This went to the grand jury. She was a likely target because she wore odd clothing and was said to have led an immoral lifestyle. And so she was determined to be a witch. She was killed. So again, 20 people in all executed, most of them women. And I recommend you look into it more. There are a few really good books on the Salem witch trials if you want to dive into that further. You can also watch things like The Crucible, but take that with a grain of salt because it's definitely been dramatized. Okay, I had paused there so the dogs would shut up. So working women. Women did a bulk of internal domestic chores like we talked about, and it's unpaid, so that doesn't offer any power. It just means you're maintaining the home. And largely women could not obtain any skills or get apprenticeships, and so they didn't really have a way to have a career. And there are a few exceptions here when young girls, usually if they didn't have a brother, their father might, show them the blacksmithing trade and might let them work in the shop a little bit, but that was very rare. For servants, they got paid the cost of survival. Again, they could not marry or have children, but indentured servants had protections that enslaved people did not. Largely, they could not be abused too much. They also, there was an end to their contract. Like, they would be done at some point, theoretically. Enslaved people, of course, paid and given nothing. So children would be taken from them because they would belong to the person who was the slaveholder, and they were never relieved of their service. And so occasionally, towards the end of someone's life, they might be granted freedom, in a token manner. Like, thank you for, being my property for so many years. 17th century, girls not pushed to read as boys were, so the standards for education were much higher always for boys than they were for girls. And we talked about those other things. So some women were able to open shops. Typically that would be, a widow whose husband died. The women would be allowed to maintain the shop. All right, let's see. We're at 14 minutes here, so I'm going to have to pause here and come back for a part 2, but that'll be a shorter one. See you soon.